So, as an introduction, Dr. Richard Gussen is a renowned advocate for the Christian entrepreneurial leadership model, author, speaker, and the founder of the Entrepreneurial Leaders Organization, or ELO. He serves an extensive international network of entrepreneurs and family business owners built over decades of client contributions, collaboration, research, lecturing, and volunteering. Rick is a sought-after speaker, strategic counsel, and advisory board member. He works at Nikola Wealth, the fastest-growing independent wealth management firm in Canada, where he focuses on business development and being a liaison between his network and the extensive resources of Nikola Wealth. Rick has extensive experience doing business on a global scale. He has taught entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial finance, strategic management, business law, international business, and ethics at universities around the world. Rick is also the founder and chairman of the Entrepreneurial Leaders Organization, which has hosted over 60 conference forums around the world since 2005. On this November 30th, this year's annual National Forum of Rick's Entrepreneurial Leaders Organization will be a virtual event based out of Winnipeg and will bring together Christian marketplace and Christian entrepreneurial leaders to connect, learn, and be inspired. The forum has a very exciting lineup of speakers, and thanks to generous sponsorship by Mr. Herb Buller, up to 50 Buller School of Business and Providence students will have an opportunity to attend the forum. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Gussen to Buller School of Business and Providence at large. Thank you for your appearance, Rick, and floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. Well, as you recall, I was on campus a month or so ago, so I have a good sense as to what the campus looks like and what the setup there is. Sorry that this had to be delayed a couple of weeks. As I shared with David, I had a severe tooth problem. So possibly one of the key takeaways from today for everyone will be, make sure you brush your teeth. It might save you some problems down the road. A couple of other things. I'll go for 30 minutes, and I'll assume that David's kind introduction won't eat into my time. So the introduction went on a couple of minutes, which is great. I always like to keep them short so I can jump right into things. Also, I've taught at universities for a number of years. One thing I've learned is, generally speaking, if the students at Providence are like students I've had in other places, the shorter it is, the more they like it. So I'll make sure I stick to 30 minutes. Well, the presentation today, as you can see, is titled Christians at Work, Finding Your Calling, Making a Difference. Now, it's quite interesting because this topic, finding your calling, which then leads to making a difference, gets back to one of the core issues. What is meaning? Now, it's quite fascinating. So for all of you listening, if you had to articulate right now, what would you say gives you meaning? So if you stripped away superficial things like, having a bit of fun, some entertainment, doing certain activities, what would you say actually gives you meaning? Now, that's quite a deep question. And for everyone listening, let's say if you're a student in your 20s, well, people go throughout life, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even on their deathbed, they still haven't found meaning in life. They've lived a frustrating life. So if we look at entrepreneurial leadership, how to use those entrepreneurial skills, finding your calling is at the core of what gives meaning to Christians. Today, this being a business school presentation, we're dealing with work and meaning. And the reason we put the two together is because for most people in our society, work is their meaning. It might sound like the classic stereotype, but it's true. I'll show as I go through the presentation that for the vast majority of people, they're defined by their work. That's their identity. That is their source of meaning. So let's scroll back a little bit and talk about the concept of meaning. I love quoting this book and referring to it. It's Viktor Frankel, Man's Search for Meaning. It's a classic book. It's not very long. I think it's 130, 150 pages. It can be read in a few hours. Viktor Frankl was a very interesting individual. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. He was actually in a Nazi concentration camp and was freed at the end of the war, and then went on to become a well-known psychologist and therapist. And as he reflected back on his time in those camps, where so many people died, so many people suffered, where there was a lot of time to think about things, he ended up concluding that the people who survived in those extreme circumstances, they weren't the fittest, they weren't the strongest, they were the people who had some reason to live beyond their present circumstances. Those are the people who survived the camps. So he developed something called logos therapy, which he then practiced for years and years. And there's people today who practice that same therapy, but it all gets down to people defining meaning. So he mentions in his book, man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life. This meaning is unique and specific in that it must and can only be fulfilled by him alone. So that's a very Christian concept, which I'll explain during the course of this presentation. But he really focused on primary motivation is meaning. So for all of you listening, it's really important at the end of our presentation, and maybe in the days to come, think about how could you define your sense of meaning? And I'll be looking at it from a Christian standpoint and tying it in with the concept of calling. So here's a second source. This is also a very interesting book, In Search of Happiness. Do you ever meet people who they just want to be happy? That's their form of meaning. I just want to do things that make me happy. That's what a lot of people think these days. So it's quite fascinating. Schumacher is a psychologist, and he did this extensive analysis to try to figure out, what's the role of happiness in our societies? And, and he's writing from a Western standpoint. So he studies Western societies, which are among the wealthiest in the history of the world. And yet in the US, for example, there's the most suicides per capita of anywhere in the world, the most people on antidepressants, the most people on medication. Basically, despite all this wealth, the most unhappy people in the world per capita are in the US. He says the quest for happiness has become nothing short of a cultural obsession. It's become so hallowed that it's beginning to resemble a cult or a religious surrogate. Now, he's not a religious person or a Christian as far as I'm aware, but it was quite interesting what he talks about. He says, basically, the pursuit of happiness is like a modern religion. So that gives a little bit of context as I'm going to delve into entrepreneurial leadership, finding your calling, finding meaning from a Christian standpoint, and then how we can make a difference. So here's what I'll cover in this presentation. And of course, this PowerPoint will be available to everyone. So that's why I've got a bit of an outline. I'm covering a lot of material, but with the idea that all of you can go back and look at this. And David assured me all of this is on the exam. So, I hope everybody pays attention. All right. First of all, meaning at work. Let me first describe what I refer to as the traditional approach. You see, this is a very simple diagram, but hopefully it'll make the point. There's work and meaning. You can see they're two separate circles. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, that's somewhat obvious. Well, this was a traditional approach, probably up into the 1970s, early 80s. On the one hand, you had work. Work could be significant, important. It could be job well done, doing your best. It's just, you've been trained for a certain profession or skill. If you're a plumber, you're doing a good job at that. You can have some satisfaction in that. If you're a lawyer, you're trained at law school, you're in a profession, you've got a career. It can all be good. So that on the one side, there's work, job well done. On the other side, there's meaning. And under this approach, people would say, well, meaning is separate. Meaning is where, religions have something to say, where you go to a temple, a church, a place of religious significance. And there's priests and pastors and people who specialize in this type of stuff. So meaning is completely separate from work. And in fact, if you go back and look at material from that genre, The two are completely separate. In fact, no, if you said to somebody 40, 50 years ago, your work is your source of meaning in life, that would almost be laughable, because they say, no, I mean, work is just what it is. It fits into something much, bigger, and meaning is done by those religious people over there. So here's a bit of a summary. And I just have this one book there, Success Secrets by Mark McCormick. It's just a classic book from that genre, where the books focus on, hey, here's how to do a job well. If you want to succeed, here's 100 ways to succeed. And you follow those rules, you'll be all, it'll all work out fine. So job well done, satisfaction, not meaning. Important, not significant. So that's what we call the traditional model. All right, so why have things changed? So again, this is, David alluded to this, like this is my own analysis or approach. I don't think you see this elsewhere, but this is how I make sense of it. So we have this traditional model. Well, what changed? Well, there's been a number of trends in society starting in the 1980s. Now, of course, we're in 2021, so this has been going on for quite a while, but it continues to persist to this day. I'm in the workforce, obviously. I can confirm absolutely 100% this same dynamic exists right now today. So there's been a number of societal trends. So number one, de-institutionalization. In the past, under the traditional model, the institutions were important. If you want to do something religiously significant, well, there's a church, and you have to be part of that church or that organization. But we've seen in the last few decades, institutions are no longer as important. And that's filtered into the Christian community also. Decades ago, you talk about churches in terms of how many members. So in other words, if you went to a church, you of course became a member. So a church would say, we have 300 members. What do churches talk about today? We have 150 attendees and 150 members. Maybe half the people who attend regularly, they're not members. They obviously they don't see the importance of membership in an institution. So institutions are not viewed in the same important way they were in the past. Secondly, relativism. Well, in the past, there was more of a view of like, there's one way to the truth. There's something definitive. Whereas today, people will talk about, well, there's many different ways, many different options. Well, if that's the case, then again, it undercuts the value of a church or an institution. Thirdly, there's something called the human potential movement, which is very much focused on self. I have the potential to do things. I have the power within me. Now, sometimes when I talk this way, you might think, well, he's probably exaggerating or stretching the point. No, this is the way people talk. I have the power within me. I have to awaken the giant within. I'm self-sufficient. I can do it on my own. It's up to me. Well, if you think that way, why would you go to a church? Why would you see a pastor or a priest? Because it's all within me. I have the power within me to become anything I want to be, create my own identity. And this is obviously manifested in today's society. My entire identity is up to me to create what I'd like. So that's how the secular approach evolved. Well, so then what happens is work and meaning, which under the traditional model were separate, then start to fuse. So work and meaning come together as one. Because what happens is religion and faith became discredited or not viewed as the way or the place to find meaning. So now there's a vacuum. So people discount, let's say, Christianity, but they don't find another religion to take its place. So there's this vacuum. So what happens? Work fits into that vacuum. Now, for those of you in the workforce, just think, there's this basic management mantra that's to get the best and most out of employees, you have to figure out how to give them a sense of purpose at and through work. Then these employees will be motivated to do their best at work for you and your company, and they will have meaning too. And you see this everywhere. I can refer to a lot of books that are, right off the press. I mean, so this is exactly what is being offered today, that work is where you find meaning. And for any of you about to enter the workforce, I would say one of the biggest challenges you'll face is the challenge to your sense of meaning. Because you get employed somewhere, whether it's a bank, a consulting firm, so many businesses, they're going to advance this notion of, hey, this is where you find meaning. And at some of the leading companies like the Googles of the world, you can sleep there, you can eat there, you join teams there, you make friends there. And also think about your identity. How do people introduce themselves? Or what's one of the first questions people ask? It's almost always, where do you work? What do you do? It's never, who are you? Or what's significant to you? So we're identified by our work and our position. So here's a classic example. This fellow is Michael Gerber. He wrote a book called The E-Myth. It's probably one of the best-selling entrepreneurship books of the last 20, 30 years. I mean, it's a great book, but what's really interesting is he comes to this fundamental point saying that in order for you to be successful in your business, you have to determine what's important to you. Once you determine what's important to you, you make it so that your business fulfills that purpose, so that when your business succeeds, you will also be fulfilled, not just make money, but you will be fulfilled. So I remember years ago, I was reading this book and I stumbled across this section. I thought, wow, this is actually a form of religious book. It's not an entrepreneurship book. So he says, but before you can determine what your role will be, you must ask yourself, what do I value most? What kind of life do I want? What do I want my life to look like? What do I wish to be? Well, does that sound like a religious book? Or does that sound like an entrepreneurship book? Well, your primary aim is your answer to all these questions. So he's saying you have to figure that out. All right, so what's the Christian approach? So we looked at the traditional approach, and then we've looked at the secular or humanist approach. So what's a Christian approach? Well, the Christian approach looks like this. You determine your sense of meaning. Your work fits into that, not the other way around. So as a Christian, anywhere you go, whether it is work or any other activity, you have a broader sense of meaning. Work fits into that. So let me just contrast the Christian approach and the secular approach. And again, I'm covering a lot of material, but I'm doing it intentionally because I want to lay out these core concepts. You'll have the PowerPoint so you can go back and, of course, refer to these things. And the book that was on the first page of my PowerPoint, there's a 200-page explanation of a lot of what I'm covering. So let's contrast the secular approach and Christian approach. So this is one thing that I think everybody needs to be very clear on, that the secular approach is very different than a Christian approach. So self-narrative versus God narrative. Secular approach, it's about me. Christian approaches, there's a so-called meta-narrative. There's a bigger story. You are fitting into the God story. The secular approach is, I'm writing my own story. Secondly, horizontal laws versus vertical laws. Horizontal laws is just like I showed with Mark McCormick, this idea of success secrets. There's many books written on the laws of success. You follow these laws, you will be successful, you will be happy, you will have meaning. Christian approaches, there's vertical laws related to God, God's commandments, laws, which we'll go over in a bit. Thirdly, attributes compared to virtues. Attributes, because often under a secular approach, the advice will be, you need to take on certain traits because they'll help you make more money, not because they're good in and of themselves. So in other words, why would you be, like, for example, why would you pursue a so-called corporate social responsibility approach? Well, because you think it's good for business. If people think it's important to be environmentally sensitive, then we'll do that. If there's no money in it, we won't. Like why would we? There's a very clear cause and effect, return on investment type of approach. Christian approaches, we have virtues, hope, love, all these different things that are the classic virtues. And we have those virtues because they're God ordained. They're important to have those virtues, work on those to reflect a Christian approach. Number 4, purpose and meaning is through work under a secular approach. Christian approaches, calling and meaning, are through a whole life offering. Number 5, this is quite interesting, self-oriented niche versus communal gift. So Self-oriented meaning it's really about me and what my skill set is and how I think I can really satisfy my own cravings and desires for a career, that type of thing. But interestingly enough, from a Christian standpoint, we have communal gifts, right? The Bible talks about gifts that are of use for the community. Last one, self-help versus divine help. All right, so that's a bit of a contrast. We're about halfway through the presentation. I'll just hit these issues at a bit of a bigger picture level, just so you get the overall idea as to what I'm driving at. All right, so let's look more at the Christian approach. So we talked about, traditional approach, secular approach, Christian approach. Well, what is the Christian approach in a bit more detail? Well, it's rooted in calling. So when we think about meaning, we have to think about the nature of calling. So whenever I talk about calling, it's always important to actually specify what calling is not, because there's a lot of misperceptions. So number one, people sometimes think there's a sacred secular divide, but that's not true. So sacred secular meaning that certain people in full-time ministry are called, other Christians are not. But that's not the case. We're all equally called. Secondly, one-time event. Calling is not a one-time occurrence. Calling can and does happen throughout your life, because your life circumstances change and you'll be called to different opportunities as you go along. Thirdly, must be audible. Sometimes people think, well, I haven't been called because I haven't heard the voice of God. Well, some people, I've interviewed and spoken with lots of business leaders. Some say they've heard the voice of God, heard an audible voice. Some people don't. Some people get a strong leading in a certain direction or a confluence of circumstances that directs them in a certain space. So it's not always audible. Fourth, calling is your job. Calling is not your job. When you retire or when you move positions or change positions, you haven't lost your calling. You just lost the job. Individual pursuit. Calling is actually pursued in the context of Christian community, because the gifts of your calling are actually used for the benefit of the community. All right, so calling is at the core of our faith. Sometimes people have said to me, well, I don't believe in the notion of calling. These are Christians who think, well, you're overstating the case. Well, if you just do simple word searches, look throughout the Bible, there's umpteen references. In fact, I've done a blog post on this. I think there's at least 100 references to calling, and you can build quite a case for the importance of calling. So we're called in one hope. We're called heavenward. We're called to eternal life. And Romans has got a great point about we are called to his purpose. Thessalonians, Paul talks about we need to live worthy of our calling. So all of us have a calling. We need to discover it and live worthy of that. The Christian approach could be summarized in effect simply as there's a general call and a personal call. So there's things that all believers are called to, and then there's things that you specifically are called to. So general aspects of calling. And again, it's covered in the book. You've got the pages listed there. Belonging to God, being godlike people in behavior, doing God's work in the world, and experiencing life purpose. This calling applies to all believers. But there's personal aspects of calling. Now, of course, people often focus just solely on the personal aspects. What am I supposed to do in life? How am I going to figure this out? Or let's say you've been laid off or outplaced or, whatever, and you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and you're thinking, well, what do I do now? Well, personal aspects of calling, here's a number of things to think about. And again, we cover them in the book, and you can see there's 7 pages listed there. So think about your passion. So who implanted that passion in you? I'm sure we all appreciate that people have very different passions. It's quite fascinating. Some people are architects, some people are dentists, some people are in construction, on and on. And you get people who are passionate about completely different things. Secondly, gifts and talents. What unique gifts or talents do you have? Things that come easily to you, but actually are a challenge for other people. Providential circumstances. Are there things that may have happened to you during the course of your life that may impact the direction that you're going to go in? So just think about some of those circumstances. Maybe you've ended up in a certain spot or had a certain experience, or some experience has been thrust upon you that you didn't expect and didn't want. Or maybe something's just come together and you think, okay, this is clearly a message that I must pursue a certain path. Fourthly, direct leading of God. There are circumstances in a lot of people's lives where there's a strong guidance or path charted out for someone, and they feel like, I just need to step into the path that's been laid out for me. So there's these personal aspects of calling. Now, I just have this in here because sometimes, especially students, maybe when you're a bit younger, you may ask certain questions about, well, like how do I figure this stuff out? Well, here's a few really basic points from Bruce Waltke, who is a religious scholar. So number one, read your Bible. Okay, hard to figure this stuff out if you're not reading the Bible. That's where the wisdom is. Secondly, develop a heart for God. He puts it that way. I'd say develop a sensitivity as to God's leading in your life. Unless you stop and reflect on what's happening to you, you'll never discern what God has intended for you. It's quite interesting. There's a lot of people who go through life without thinking about it. Now, you may think that sounds ridiculous, but one thing that I do, and other people I know do this also, but every week I reflect on the week that was. So usually Fridays, I take half a day and I just think through what I did that week, what things were my priorities, what unexpected things came up, what did I learn from people I met, what can I change, on and on. And I find when I spend, you might think 4 hours just thinking about the week. Well, a week, 6.5 days, 4 hours. So you're sort of thinking, praying through, reflecting on things. That's where you can really see how God's moving in your life. And then when you do that over time, then you start to get perspective on how you're in a much different place than maybe you were 6 months ago, 12 months ago. Thirdly, seek wise counsel. Always good to have wise counsel. We have something called peer advisory groups. So if you think wise counsel, I don't know if anybody would think this, but if you think wise counsel is only for people who don't really know any better, well, that's completely untrue. We have peer advisory groups. We have people in our groups who are running companies in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions. I mean, people are running large enterprises, and it's almost always those people who realize they need wise counsel. So I would just encourage everybody, think about getting input from other people. Fourthly, does this make sense? It's almost like the old smell test. Just think, okay, does this actually make any sense? So this is where it's good to ask someone who's got your best interest at heart, who can give you some input. Fifthly, divine intervention. Always be aware of these circumstances where you think, what's the chances of this happening completely randomly? Now, I've had things happen to me that I think, okay, there's no other way. There's too many things that have lined up and pushed me in a certain direction that clearly this was God's leading, absolutely. And I have a lot of other people who would have experienced the same thing. So always bear that in mind. One thing I like to say is God plans in advance of our ability to understand. So sometimes we're directed into certain experiences. We may not quite understand why we're getting, directed there. But then in retrospect, maybe weeks, months, years later, we say, okay, you know what, that experience, maybe that failure prepared me for something very significant. All right, Os Guinness is a great writer. I assume a lot of you would have heard of him. He's written a great book on calling. It's probably one of the best books on calling that's been written. He talks about calling as a purposeful journey. He separates or distinguishes calling versus vocation. And then ultimately, he always says, everything is subject to God's intervention. It's all in God's hands. Ultimately, we can live our calling, but we're not determining the framework. We're not determining the things that can sometimes happen. Our job as a Christian is to live our calling within the bookends of life and within the parameters we've been given. And calling is subjective, not objective. Subjective meaning calling, we're expected to live our calling, not somebody else's calling. There's one funny quote. There's a guy, Oscar Wilde, who had this great line: "Don't try to live someone else's life. It's already been taken." So I hope no one out there is thinking, oh, I really look up to so-and-so. I'm going to be the mini version of so-and-so. Now, that's a really, really bad idea. That's already been taken. You live your own life. That's what we're expected to do, not live someone else's. All right, here's a great quote. Calling is the truth that God calls us to himself so decisively that everything we are, everything we do, everything we have is invested with a special devotion and dynamism in response to his summons and service. All right, we're getting close to the end. We've got a couple minutes left. I just want to highlight a few people quickly. So what is the Christian approach in a practical way? So I've got 3 P's, sort of like a good sermon, 3 P's. All right, number 1, passion. Here's Mark Burnett. He's the guy behind Survivor, Shark Tank, Celebrity Apprentice, The Voice. I want to be a noisy Christian. I'm passionate about telling biblical stories. He's also the guy behind AD and other biblical movies out there. So has a massive influence in Hollywood, but he wants to be a noisy Christian. We had him speak at our conference a number of years ago. I mean, this guy is absolutely on fire, but is clearly rooted in his calling and how he wants to make a difference. Another guy, purpose. Calling relates to purpose. I assume a lot of you have the YouVersion Bible app. Bobby Grunewald, when he spoke at our conference, it was downloaded only 10 or 20 million times. Now it's been downloaded, I think it's 450 million times. It's crazy. So Bobby Grunewald was really intent on the purpose of getting the word out. So great example. Another one, Lord Robert Edmondson. He's a billionaire out of the UK. And it was really interesting because in terms of his priorities, he says, I've often thought on my deathbed, am I going to think about the last $1 million that I've made or the person in the prison who was dying of AIDS who I spoke to and became a Christian? So despite this fellow's wealth, extraordinarily humble guy, he's giving a vast amount of his fortune to Christian charities. I think he's up to about $500 million he's given away to various charities. So phenomenal example. And the last one, a bonus, persistence. I love this quote. When everyone is telling me to throw in the towel, I want to be like Rocky in the 15th round. He looks like his face has been through the meat grinder, yet he gets up and wins. Without that sense of calling, I might not be able to get up off the mat. So lastly, you apply that calling to making a difference. There's various ways you can do it. And then lastly, just to summarize, so difference making is rooted in calling. We talked about passion, purpose, priorities, and persistence. So we're at 30 minutes, and I realize I've covered a lot of material. In some ways, it's reflected in a 200-page book, and of course, you can look at the PowerPoint presentation after.